The land stretched so wide it felt like the sky had grown weary of reaching and fallen down to rest against the earth. It was July light, flat, pale, and endless, rolling over the caliche stone that gave the ridge its name. Wind moved through sagebrush in a rhythm older than time. It brought with it the scent of iron, mesquite, and something else, faint but wrong, like a flower blooming in the wrong season. Elias was a man who understood silence better than sound. He rarely spoke, even to his horse, a dun mare named Crow, who had gone half blind in her right eye, but never missed a step. Every morning before the sun cleared the rim of the world, Elias walked the fence line south of the cottonwoods. That day was no different, or so it seemed. He knelt beside a post that had split at the root. Termites had been at it. Elias tapped the wood with his knuckles, the sound hollow, then straightened up slowly, spine aching like a gate hinge. As he stood, he noticed something by the grove, white against the dry green, still as a ghost. At first he thought it was a bedsheet hung and forgotten. Then it moved. She sat on the ground, not leaning against anything, just folded into herself like a broken thing. The dress she wore was satin, impossibly clean in this dusty country, with a hem that dragged through burr and seed, lace sleeves, gloves she'd torn at the fingers, and a veil, crumpled, half-pinned to the side of her head. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears. Her shoulders shook, but no sound came from her. Elias didn't speak, he simply watched. A morning dove passed low over them both, wings whispering like paper. The woman didn't flinch. There was a heaviness to her stillness, like she'd turned to stone from the inside out. Elias took a step forward, his boots crunching on brittle earth. The woman didn't move. Another step, still nothing. When he was within 6 feet, she looked up. Eyes like wet coal, rimmed red, met his. She blinked once, slow, deliberate, and looked away again toward the grove. Elias studied her. He noted the swelling around one wrist, the faint scrape on her cheek, the way her fingers clutched at the fabric of her dress like it might hold her together. He saw the shoes, white satin, made for churches or ballrooms, not this soil. He didn't ask what had happened. That wasn't his way, and maybe she wouldn't have answered. Instead, he removed his hat, nodded once, and walked back toward his homestead, not looking back. He figured if she wanted to follow, she would. She didn't. That night, the wind rose and carried dust through the cracks in the cabin walls. Elias sat inside, sharpening a knife that had seen more wood than flesh. Crow shifted in her stall out back, uneasy. Something about the evening felt brittle. When he stepped onto the porch to douse the lamp, he looked out toward the cottonwood grove. She was still there, in the dark. The next morning she was closer. Elias found her sitting at the edge of his fence near the gate, still in that dress, still quiet. Eyes downcast, her hands folded over her knees. Her veil was gone. Her hair, a dark tumble of loose curls, was tangled and hung in damp strands around her face. He opened the gate. She didn't move. He walked past her, into the barn, began his morning routine, mucking stalls, feeding Crow, grinding corn for the hen that refused to lay. When he returned to the porch, there was a hollow clink beside the door, a porcelain cup he didn't own, turned upside down and filled with wild mint. She'd left it. The next day she stood on the porch. The day after that, she swept it. By the week's end, Elias built her a cot under the overhang, tucked into the corner where the sun barely reached. He didn't ask her name. She didn't offer one. She ate what he set out, beans, hard bread, stew if he was generous. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. She cried every night at dusk. It wasn't loud, not sobbing, just a kind of hitch in the breath, like the way a deer shivers in tall grass when it thinks it's unseen. Elias didn't watch, but he heard, from his bed through the wall, like a songbird with a broken note. One evening, he placed a blanket by her cot. She used it, but didn't look at him. Another morning, she was gone from the porch. For a moment, his chest tightened in a way he didn't care to admit. But then he saw her, barefoot, sleeves rolled, scrubbing the old tin basin by the well. She looked up at him briefly and nodded. as if acknowledging his existence for the first time. Elias returned the nod. Later that week, she found an old saddle blanket in the barn, moth-eaten and frayed. She stitched it. Elias watched her fingers move, nimble and sure, threading calm into wool. She still hadn't spoken. A fortnight passed before she touched the mare. Crow stood patiently while the woman stroked her flank, whispering something too soft to catch. Her hand trembled, but her voice did not. She mounted awkwardly, side saddle, and let the horse carry her in wide, lazy circles. Elias watched from the porch, his coffee going cold. The wind shifted that afternoon, carrying a scent from town, coal smoke and train metal. She paused mid-circle and looked east. Her face was unreadable, but her posture changed. She dismounted, walked inside the barn, and stayed there until the sun sank. The next morning, Elias found a ring on his workbench, twisted wire, carefully shaped, with a small chipped turquoise set into it. It was crude but deliberate. No note, no explanation. He didn't ask. The dress never came off. Not fully. She had washed it, stitched parts, cut off the train, but she wore it still, every day. Some mornings with boots, others with bare feet. It no longer looked like something sacred. It looked lived in, worn down to the shape of grief and grit. In the light of dawn, she stood sometimes by the sycamore, her shadow long against the red dirt. Elias watched from the barn window, the scent of hay and leather mixing with something he couldn't name. He didn't need to understand her, only to let her stay. Mornings settled like ash in that corner of the prairie, soft, pale, and dry. The wind slowed, the soil cooled, and the air thinned until everything moved as if underwater. Life didn't hurry here. It didn't need to. Time crept between fence posts and boot steps, through the seams of cabin wood, and into the spaces between two people who shared everything but their names. She had not left. That was enough for Elias. The porch became her place. She rose with the sun, though she rarely looked at it. The white dress, yellowing now at the cuffs, was always the first thing moving in the morning breeze. She would sweep the steps, pour out the night's wash water, set the tin cup on the ledge. Always in silence, always precise. The weeping had stopped, or at least changed. It no longer came every dusk. Now it came only when the wind carried certain smells, grease, paper, perfume, or when train whistles blew from the east. Even then, she never let it last long. The days turned practical. She made bread with an efficiency that suggested a life once rooted in kitchens. She cleaned tools, polished the window glass, and began repairing things Elias hadn't even known were broken. Shutters, hinges, frayed edges of woven rugs. Once she found a block of beeswax in the pantry, hardened with age, and began softening it in a tin cup. She used it to seal leather, rub into door joints, polish wooden spoons. Her movements were slow, sure, and quiet, like someone who'd once been a wife and had forgotten what that meant, or someone who'd never been one but had watched closely. Elias didn't ask. He wouldn't have known how. There were small things. Each morning she set out 2 cups instead of 1. She never poured for him, never presumed, but the second cup waited. He didn't always take it, but when he did, she'd nod, just once, barely perceptible, and return to kneading or sweeping. Once she folded a strip of muslin and tucked it under the coffee pot to keep it from clattering on the stove. Another time, he came back from the ridge to find the barn door painted the color of dry tobacco leaf, clean, subtle. She had used a brush made from her own hair, bound with horse thread. He began calling her the woman, in thought, if not speech. It wasn't a title, just a placeholder in his mind where something softer might grow. Elias had never been a man of adornment. His world was earth, leather, hooves, and salt. But one afternoon, while sorting through rusted bits in the tool shed, he found an old silver spoon, bent and half blackened. He held it up to the light. It caught sun. He wiped it clean, then left it on her work table next to the beeswax and thread. No note, no reason. The next morning, it was gone. 3 days later, a small object appeared on the table where he cleaned his rifles. It was a ring, silver, shaped from the spoon's bowl, smooth except for a shallow etching along the inside, a single curve like the stem of a letter never finished. He didn't put it on, not yet. They shared no words, but each task became a sentence, each glance a chapter. In the dust, a new language bloomed. One afternoon, Elias returned from the North Trail, saddlebag torn from a mesquite snag. He dropped it on the porch and sat hard in the chair, groaning without meaning to. His knee had stiffened again. The woman, who'd been washing the porch steps with a rag, paused. She stood, walked inside, and returned with a basin of warm water. He didn't stop her. She knelt, placed the basin beside his boot, and untied the laces with a care that felt neither wifely nor servile, just present. When she peeled the boot off, he winced. She said nothing. Her hands were steady as she wiped the dust away and pressed the warm rag to the joint. She didn't look at his face. She focused on the limb like it was a sick animal she meant to soothe. Then she stood and walked away. The next day, his boot was mended and oiled, sitting by the porch door. The dress she wore began to change, though subtly. She had cut the sleeves off one morning after slicing them open on a nail. The hem came up next, torn and then trimmed. By the end of the week, she had taken the lace from the bodice and used it to bind the handle of Elias's coffee pot, which had grown too hot to touch. The transformation wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. The wedding dress, once pristine, became a uniform marked by earth, fire, flower, and rain. Still she wore it. She wore it while gathering eggs, while hauling water, while brushing down the old mare, Crow, who had taken a quiet liking to her. Elias often found them together near the old sycamore, her brushing, the mare still as a chapel bench. Once he saw her place her cheek against the animal's shoulder, eyes closed. That evening, he offered her something unspoken. The second mare had been untouchable for weeks, a paint with white lashes and an unpredictable gait. Elias had caught her 2 months prior and never found the rhythm to break her. That morning he led the paint into the corral. She came to the fence, hands tucked behind her back, head slightly tilted. He didn't speak, just opened the gate, walked in with the rope. The horse shifted, coiled, tested the tension. Elias was patient. He didn't ride that day. He just stood near the paint for an hour, letting her feel him. The woman watched the whole time. The next day, she stepped into the corral with Elias. He handed her the rope. She didn't flinch. The paint came forward, hesitant, snorting dust. The woman reached out, open-palmed. The horse sniffed, ears twitching. Then, impossibly, she allowed her nose to be touched. They named the horse Truth. That night, the air held warmth without heat. A breeze moved over the land like breath from something dreaming. Elias sat on the porch, ring in his hand, watching the last sliver of orange light bleed away. The woman emerged from the barn, hair damp, dress loose at the collar. She sat across from him without a word. He stood, walked inside, and returned with something wrapped in cloth. He placed it beside her bowl of stew. She unwrapped it slowly. It was another ring, rough, simple, made from an old spurs rowel, hammered flat, the point dulled into a curve. It bore no decoration. She looked at it, then at him, and then she slipped it on her finger. No words, no thanks, no questions. She returned to her stew. Elias watched her eat. In the silence that followed, something shifted, not in the air, not in the earth, but in the space between their shadows. It wasn't love, not yet. Love is too loud a word for what passed between them, but it was something true, something they had built, one act at a time in the absence of speech and the presence of choice. She was still nameless, but she was not nobody, and she was not gone. It was the wind that warned him. It came down off the mesas one morning, early and strange, dry yet warm, laced with the faint scent of cedar rot and distant rain, a wind that didn't belong in that season. It passed through the grass in fitful pulses, tossing seed and ash into the air like some old ghost shaking out its lungs. The chickens refused to leave their coop. Crow pawed at the dirt, her blind eye twitching. Truth kicked at her stall once, and then stood stiff, like she'd heard something no one else had. Elias woke before the first light, and knew, without knowing how, that something was wrong. The woman had not come from the barn. He stepped out, boots half-laced, shirt still open at the chest. The door to the barn stood ajar, swaying on its hinges. Inside, the dim light revealed her, crumpled in the straw, her wedding dress soaked through with sweat and dust. Her arm was curled beneath her head like a child's, her breath shallow and fast. Her skin had taken on a strange shine, as though oiled. Elias didn't speak. He lifted her with effort, her body light but limp, and carried her inside the cabin. She didn't stir. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her hair damp and cold. He laid her on the cot in the corner, the one she had never used until now. The fever had arrived. For 3 days, time turned to syrup. She moaned softly, like someone trapped halfway between dreams and dying. She whispered things Elias couldn't make out, fragments of places he'd never seen, names he didn't recognize. Her dress was peeled away and hung outside, heavy with sweat. He placed wet cloths along her neck and wrists, boiled water, crushed leaves he remembered from a Paiute healer years ago, and prayed to nothing. Her eyes stayed shut. Elias didn't leave her side. He ate little, spoke less. The days passed in sounds, the pop of the stove, the drip of water, the creak of the chair beside her cot. At night, the wind never stopped. It circled the house as if looking for a way in. Once he thought he saw someone standing beneath the sycamore, tall, unmoving, watching. But when he stepped outside, the figure was gone. On the fourth morning, she opened her eyes. They were glassy but aware, 2 dark stones half sunk in a riverbed. She didn't speak, just looked at him, blinking slowly as though trying to place his face. He didn't smile, he only nodded. The fever hadn't taken her, not this time. She slept the rest of the day, deep, dreamless sleep. Elias rose only to feed the animals and return. The sun dipped. Lamps burned low. At some point he fell asleep in the chair, arms crossed, his hat tipped over his eyes. In the morning she was sitting up. She was thinner, her cheeks hollowed slightly, her lips dry and cracked. But her hands were moving again, pulling thread through cloth, mending the very blanket that had soaked up her sickness. There was no smile on her face, but there was steadiness. Elias moved from the chair to the window. Outside, the wind had finally gone. The world was still again. She turned her head slowly, as though remembering she had one, and looked at the sun slanting through the slats. Then her eyes settled on something by the windowsill. It was a piece of cedar, small and hand-carved. Her name was written there, though no one had spoken it aloud. Mercy. The letters were etched with the point of a nail, rough and uneven, but clear. Beneath the name was a mark, part flame, part river. Something symbolic, though even Elias couldn't say what it meant. It had come to him in the fever nights, in the space between hope and guilt. Mercy touched the wood. Her fingers lingered on the name as if testing its truth. She did not ask if it was hers. She simply nodded once. By the week's end, she was back on the porch, though she moved slower now. Her body had thinned, but her steps had gained weight. She no longer flinched at sound. She no longer wept at dusk. She began to hum. The sound was quiet, sometimes tuneless, but alive. It came when she shelled peas or mended boots, when she brushed down the mare or swept the porch. Elias never interrupted it. It was not meant for him. It was a sound for her own bones. One morning, she took down the wedding dress from its hook and folded it into a box she had made from scavenged wood. She lined it with wool and cedar leaves and placed it on the highest shelf in the barn, where neither of them could reach it without effort. It was not a burial, just a rest. Later that day, Elias found her behind the cabin, turning the soil with a bent hoe. Her hands were blistered. Her hair was pulled back with a piece of leather cord. The land here was poor, clay and rock, but she worked it anyway. He watched her for a while. Then, without a word, fetched the water bucket, and began to dig alongside her. They did not plant anything that day, but the earth was moved. One night near the fire, Elias carved again, another small piece of cedar. This time he did not write. He only shaped the wood into a small, faceless figure. A woman, perhaps, or a flame. Something neither, and both. He placed it beside her cup the next morning. She picked it up, turned it over in her hand, and placed it in the pocket of her apron. The days that followed were quieter than before, but richer. The silences grew warm, not cold. Elias noticed that Mercy no longer looked east when the train blew its whistle. Instead, she stood still, hands resting on the railing, her gaze level. He watched her in profile, cheekbone, eyelash, jaw, and saw something no longer unfinished, but unspoken. That was when he knew the fever had taken something from her, but it had left something too. Mercy was not healed. That kind of healing doesn't happen in stories like these. The past had not left her, nor had it been named, but something inside her had turned, from retreat to return, from wound to scar. She walked now with weight in her steps and softness in her silence. Elias felt it, though he did not understand it. One night, as the last firelight faded and the wind turned warm again, she reached out and touched his hand, just once, then returned to her sewing. It was more than enough. The air was dry as ash, and the days had begun their slow shift toward autumn, not the hard fall of gold leaves and frost, but the subtle kind, the whisper of shorter shadows, the hush before cold. The sky stretched wider, bluer. The cicadas quieted. Even the land seemed to hold its breath. Mercy had found her rhythm again. She rose early, sometimes before Elias, and walked the line of the pasture, a tin pail swinging gently at her side. She gathered wild persimmons when she could find them, and tucked them into a jar with salt. She had taken to whittling small objects, spoons, buttons, the vague outline of a sparrow. Nothing precise, just shapes her hands seemed to remember. The wordless bond between them thickened, not with drama, but with repetition. The morning routines, the firewood stacked just so, the kettle always warm by midday. He began leaving his tools out for her to mend. She began mending things without waiting to be asked. The world narrowed to the land, the sky, and the cabin, but the paint mare, truth, remained untamed. She had eyes like polished stone and a streak of rust down her shoulder, skittish, fast, proud. Elias had caught her 4 months ago out near Bitter Draw, half-starved and lightning quick. Since then she'd been corralled but untouched, too clever for the bit, too wary for the saddle. Elias tried once more to train her, early one morning. Mercy stood by the fence, one hand resting lightly on the top rail, her face calm. Elias entered the corral with a lead rope and patience, but Truth had no interest in being led. She tossed her head, kicked dust, spun away. Her hooves struck sparks off the rocks. Elias tried again, quiet hands, slow breath, the way he'd been taught. But the mare wheeled and charged the fence, stopping just short of Mercy. Mercy didn't move. She reached out, open-palmed, and the horse stilled. Something passed between them. Not submission, not fear, just a pause, an agreement, unseen and unsaid. Mercy stepped into the corral, took the lead rope, and let it drop. She did not tie it. She did not pull. She simply walked beside the mare. Truth followed. Elias didn't say anything. He watched them circle once, then again. No pressure, no bit, no saddle. The rhythm was loose, but alive. When Mercy stopped, the horse stopped. When she knelt, the horse lowered its head. When she turned and left the corral, the horse remained behind, but calmer, as if a storm had broken without thunder. That evening, Elias found Mercy in the barn, oiling a halter with beeswax. Her hands moved slow and sure. He walked to her, placed something beside the lantern. It was a ring, wrought from an old spurs wheel, hammered flat. No gem, no polish. Just the curve of something that had been through use and fire. She looked at it for a long while, then picked it up, turned it over, and slid it onto her finger. There was no ceremony, no speech. She didn't even look at him. But she did not take it off. They did not call each other husband or wife. No one had said marriage. No one had mentioned love. Still, the world began to fold itself around their pattern. Elias built a second shelf for her tools beside his. She placed her cedar figurine next to the rifle he kept above the door. They began to eat from the same tin plate. She mended his shirt sleeves without asking. He soaked her boots in vinegar to soften the leather. It wasn't affection in the way people tell it. It was service, time, proximity. Each action carried meaning that could not be spoken. In town, folks had begun to notice. Once a month, Elias rode in for flour, salt, and tobacco. Now he came with another list: darning needles, brown sugar, lavender soap. People saw the change. At the mercantile, old Mrs. Greaves squinted up at him. "You've taken someone in," she said. Elias didn't reply. "She wearing white?" the woman asked. "Word is, some girl ran east from a wedding out in Junction. Preacher's daughter. Found her dress near the rail lines. No one ever saw her again." He counted his coins slowly. Mrs. Greaves leaned closer. "You give her your name?" Elias looked up then. His eyes were steady. "She doesn't need mine." And with that, he walked out, never looking back. At home, Mercy had begun naming things, not out loud, but in small ways. The orange tabby that wandered in from the hills was now Thread. The broken fence post by the north field she'd wrapped with a strip of linen, Wound. A patch of wild mint by the well was marked with a stone etched with the word Quiet. She never said these names aloud, but Elias began using them. One evening, while brushing crow, he muttered, "We'll go by Quiet first, then head to the ridge." Mercy, sweeping the porch, paused for half a second, then nodded. They spent more time near the sycamores. The fevered days had left a mark there. Mercy sat beneath the largest tree most evenings, Truth grazing close by. She wore the ring always now, turning it with her thumb like a clock without hands. Once, Elias sat beside her. They said nothing. She leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and he did not move. One night, a storm came hard and sudden, rain like gravel, wind like broken teeth. The roof groaned, the animals brayed. Elias bolted upright and ran to the barn. Mercy was already there, holding Truth's reins, calm as ever. Lightning flashed, white and brutal. Elias shouted, "You all right?" She nodded, soaked through. The paint mare pressed close to her. When the thunder hit, loud enough to shake the rafters, Elias reached out and pulled Mercy to him, held her tight, not with passion, but with protection. Her breath slowed against his chest. After a while she whispered something. He didn't hear it fully, but he heard one word: "Stay." He did. The next morning everything was washed clean. The grass gleamed. The dust had settled. The wind smelled of pine. Elias walked out to the ridge. Mercy followed. No saddle, no rope. Just the two of them and Truth, who walked without bridle. They stood there for a long time, overlooking the plain. "Still think she's wild?" Mercy asked softly, the first time she'd spoken more than a word in weeks. Elias looked at the horse, then at her. "No more than you," he said. They stood in silence. The wind moved past them, slow and sure. The land had gone ochre, grasses brittle and bowing under their own weight. The cottonwoods near the creek had started to let go of their leaves, one by one, like slow confessions. The days shortened almost unnoticed, and morning frost whispered across the porch rail before vanishing at first sun. Elias, as always, rose with the pale blue edge of dawn, but now when he stepped outside, 2 tin cups waited on the step, one already filled. Mercy no longer looked like a woman who had been broken, nor did she look whole. She was something else now, weathered, tempered, reshaped in fire and silence. She still wore white, though not always. She had stitched new skirts from grain sacks and lined them with torn lace from the dress. The rest of the gown, the bodice, the fine stitching around the waist, had been folded and buried in the barn under the floorboards without ceremony. Just her hands in the dirt and a flat stone to mark the spot. Elias saw the change, but didn't comment. That was his way. They began to ride together, not far, not fast, just out to the ridgeline, sometimes past the old well house, sometimes to the canyon's edge, where the wind carried hawk cries like stories, half remembered. Truth bore Mercy with a strange pride, ears forward, body loose, gait smooth as smoke. The paint mare had accepted no one else, even Elias. Crow, old and steady, carried him without question, blind eye and all. The two horses moved like a reflection, one dark and cautious, the other bright and unbending. Mercy always rode in silence, but sometimes she sang, not loud, not with words, just a kind of humming, low and unsure, like someone learning to remember the sound of their own voice. Elias never joined her, but once when her song fell away into wind, he said softly, "You ought to keep that." She didn't answer, but he saw her mouth curve just slightly. In town, they had become something of a tale. A woman in a wedding dress riding a paint mare, a cowboy with a scar down his temple, and a voice like dry paper. No one called them husband and wife. No one used names. At the feed store, the clerk said, "That fellow with the silent woman." At the Mercantile, "The man who never looks anyone in the eye." At the saloon, "She came from nowhere, didn't she?" One time, a boy, no older than 10, approached them outside the smithy. "What's her name?" he asked Elias, blinking up with dust in his eyelashes. Elias looked at Mercy. She stood beside Truth, hand resting on the mare's shoulder, her hair tucked under a faded scarf. She met his gaze without blinking. Elias replied, "She needed a place. That was all." The boy didn't understand, but he remembered the way they stood side by side, like a pair of carved figures in a chapel no one prayed in anymore. That winter, snow came soft and early. They didn't leave the homestead for nearly 2 weeks. Elias stacked wood taller than a man. Mercy cured meat and hung it by the stove. They worked in quiet tandem, the space between them less and less, like absence. Some evenings they would sit by the fire, not close, not touching, just near enough to feel the warmth of each other's presence. She carved more often now, shapes that grew clearer, a feather, a wolf, a hand. Elias once found a small figure tucked into his saddlebag, a man on a horse, head bowed. He carried it with him from then on. One morning, she left a letter on the table, just a scrap of paper, folded once. Elias saw it, untouched it for nearly an hour, then finally opened it. Inside, written in her delicate small handwriting, "I don't need to go back, but I needed to say it out loud." That evening he gave her something in return, a lead coin, old and worn, with no markings, a relic from a time before either of them. He pressed it into her palm without a word. Mercy looked at it, then at him. "I'll carry it," she said. They never spoke of past lives. But the silence they kept between them was not the silence of secrets. It was the silence of mercy, a shared vow without voice. They had no altar, no papers, no witnesses, only the way he passed her the bread first, the way she cleaned his boots before every ride, the way their shadows stretched together as the sun fell. In late spring, a stranger came, a young man with sharp boots and city questions. He claimed to be looking for a preacher's daughter gone missing some years back. "Ran out in a wedding dress," he said, squinting at Elias. "They thought maybe she drowned." Elias sat on the porch. He didn't move, didn't call for mercy. The man tried again. "You heard of anyone like that? Woman, dark hair, wears white?" Elias lit a match, held it, let it burn close to his fingers before tossing it to the dirt. "There's no one here by that name," he said. The man lingered, looked past Elias toward the barn, then slowly turned and rode off. When the dust settled, Mercy stepped from the doorway. She didn't ask who he was. She simply said, "Thank you." And he replied, "Don't need thanks, just stay." That evening they rode out together, past the edge of the Caliche Ridge, beyond even the fence line. The wind came gentle, filled with the smell of green mesquite and fresh grass. Mercy rode ahead, Truth's mane catching the sun. Elias followed, crow steady as breath. They reached a high bluff, and the world below opened wide, hills folding into each other like old blankets, the sky pressed close enough to touch. She turned in the saddle. "What do they call this place?" she asked. Elias looked out across the horizon. The light painted her skin gold. He didn't answer, because there was no name. And that, in the end, was the point.